Okay, so this is part 4 of the Datagrid walkthrough, and basically what we're going to try and do in this step is to be able to pass data from the Windows forms to the user control. So we're going to pick the edit employee and we're going to mock up an employee in the edit employee Windows form and try and send it down to the employee control, the user control we've just defined. So the problem that we're trying to solve is how can we create data in the Windows Forms project which can be understood by the user control. And effectively what the problem amounts to is that if we define an employee class in our Datagrid walkthrough, the Windows Forms project, then it's only available in that project. It can't be shared back down to the user control because we're already looking from the Datagrid walkthrough Windows Forms project down to the user control, and you can only have references working in one direction. So you can't have the user control trying to be referenced back up to the Datagrid walkthrough. That would end up with being a circular reference, and that doesn't work. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a third project called the model project, and the model project is a common enough project to create in lots of different applications, and effectively what it shows is all the classes in their plainest sense, in other words just the properties that exist for those particular classes. So over here in the solution I've created a model project which is of type class library. So I would have gone up to my solution and I would have right clicked and I would have added a new project and called it a class library project and then named it model. So when that was created, I would have then added my employee class. And so my employee class is quite plain and simple. It's just public class employee, and then it's got 4 properties: the ID, the first name, the surname, and the pay. ID and pay are of type int and double respectively, and first name and surname are of type string. And all the properties are public, and so that's just our employee class. So once we define our class employee inside our model project, what we need to do next is share that data out with both the Datagrid walkthrough project and the user control project. And so how we do that is by adding references. So the user control project needs to be able to see the model, so what we're going to do is right click on references, add a reference, go over to here, make sure that your solution is selected, make sure that the project is selected, and then only select model. You'll see that the Datagrid walkthrough is available to be checked, but because we're in the user control project, we don't want to select the Datagrid walkthrough, so only the model project should be selected. So when that's selected, you can select OK. What that means now is that the user control can now see the code in the model, and it means that we can create employee classes or objects in our user control project. So then in our Datagrid walkthrough we'll want to do the same thing. So what we'll do is right click, add a reference, make sure that the solution is selected and that the project is selected, and then over here you just have to check model. From the previous version you should have user control already checked. So both of them will be checked for the Windows Forms project. So then select OK. The next thing is that we're going to mock up in our edit employee Windows form, we're going to mock up what an employee will look like. So we're going to create a temporary employee. So if you look here, I've created in the constructor for the edit employee Windows form, I've created an employee class called test, an object called test. Then I said test.id is 123, test.firstname is John, test.surname is Murphy, test.pay is 1000, and that's just a temporary employee class that I'm going to, a temporary employee object that I'm going to use. Just again to be aware, later on it'll come into effect, but this is in the constructor of edit employee and it's after the initialize component method has been called. So it's not quite important just yet, but it will in a few minutes when we get to the next section. So going back into the user control, what I want to do is to be able to open a window into my user control to be able to accept that data. And so what I'm going to do in here, in my employee control, which is the user control, I'm going to create an employee property. So the employee property is going to have a data type employee, which comes from the model, and it's going to be called, it's named employee, EMPLOYE is the name here. Okay, so that's effectively a way of allowing data to flow into the user control. So by creating that public property, that means that if anyone creates an instance of an employee control, they can associate data with my employee property. Just to be aware as well that up at the top, you need to make sure that you have your using model reference, the namespace for the project, which contains the employee class is called model, and so you'll just have to have your using statement up above in the class file using model whenever you're using the employee class. Okay, so now we have a way of sending data into our employee class. So let's go back to our edit employee. So back in our edit employee, we have created our employee entity, and now what we want to do is to be able to share that with the user control. So what we do is we gain reference to our user control, which I've just renamed to UC employee. So UC for user control and employee because it's the employee user control. And you can see that it has a property on it called employee. And so what that's doing is that's the little window that I can send employee data into the user control so it can receive it for me. So I'm just associating my test object with the employee property of my user control. Just to touch on this user control employee name, where that has come from, it's just like when you rename a button or when you rename a label, you can give your user controls names. So in my edit employee, what I've done is I've gone to the control, I've selected my properties, and then over here in the name section I've just called it UC employee, which just is a friendly name that I'm using for it. Okay, so that's just that. Now back in our user control, what we need to do is the person who's consuming our user control employee control, the person who's using that, they're sending us in the data through the property. The next thing is we have to take advantage of the fact that that has been done. So in other words, we have to take the data out of our employee property and store it against the text boxes that are available on the control. So again, in our employee control load event, we have already got code relating to the edit only and the read only sections. So they're just checking to see if it's edit only, then turn off the ability to change the text and the ID field. If it's read only, then turn off the ability to change any of them. So in that same section, in the employee control underscore load, what we're doing in here is we're going checking to see has anyone set any data to the employee property. So there's an employee property, and when someone creates an instance of this employee control, the user control, they may or may not have set the employee property. If they haven't set the employee property, well then we don't want to have to check any data against the text boxes. So we don't want to have to associate any data. Effectively, there will be no data to associate. However, if someone has created an instance of the employee control and told us about an employee, they've sent in some employee into the property, well then we want to take that data out of the property and associate it with the text boxes. So what we're doing in this section of the code is the first line is the if statement, and it's checking to see if the employee property is not null. If the employee property is not null, that means someone has sent us something. And so if they've sent us something, then that means we have data to associate with the text boxes. So then what we do is we take the data out of the employee object and associate it with the text box, such as in the first line, it's txtid.text. It is assigned the information from the employee.id, so id is the property on employee, and then we just have to convert that to a string because id is of type int. And then we do the same thing for the first name, so it's txtfname.text is assigned the information from employee.firstname, We don't need to do any conversion to strings because first name is a string. Then we do it for surname, and then we do it for pay. And that's pretty much it for part 4. So next we'll move on to part 5.